do that. And we'll get started. We have today's session and two more sessions, 2 more weeks after this week of the forage management theme in the Lunchtime series. So we hope you'll be able to join us for those. Probably within the next day or so, you should be able to get on the beef.okstate.edu website and listen and see or listen to today's video, but you'll also should see the new or next Lunchtime series agenda posted on the website beef.okstate.edu, and so be sure and look into that. Dr. Alex Rocatelli has taken the lead on designing a 5-session series revolving around incorporating alfalfa in the grazing management system. Kind of got it tailored, or speakers lined up for both Eastern Oklahoma and Western Oklahoma environments. And then we'll talk about a lot of different topics I think are of a lot of interest, like putting up haylage versus harvesting hay. Dr. Beck's going to talk about incorporating alfalfa hay into growing rations and finishing rations. So I think there will be a little bit for just about everyone. Okay, so let me share my slides that I have prepared for today. And our topic today is late summer supplementation to enhance cattle performance, and really what it boils down to is enhancing forage utilization, efficiency, and I'm not sure why my slides are not advancing. There we go. Okay. All right, so if you, this graph, first of all, somebody, Paul, Brian, Earl, are you seeing this okay? Tell me what you are seeing.
We're seeing the combined auctions Oklahoma Steer Seasonal Price Index.
Perfect, excellent. So, you know, this would be one reason why people might consider stretching the summer grazing season with stocker cattle. And that's because if you know, the seasonal price index here, if you look at the heavier weight yearling cattle, and the green line represents 875-pound average weight steers, brown is 775, and black is 675. So those heavier weight classes of cattle price generally, obviously not always, but generally holds up well through the late part of the summer. And so, but the challenge, as we're going to talk about a little more in depth here in a minute, is that forage quality is gradually declining during particularly the July and August period, the period we're into here right now. And so how to maintain acceptable animal performance and yet be able to take advantage of those extended price advantages there later in the summer. And that's one of the advantages of implementing a program like the Oklahoma Gold or Super Gold program that we'll cover here today. And slides, there we go. So this is just a couple of recent pictures of cattle grazing. On the left there, you've got native rangeland, and that's burned native pasture, primarily tall grass species. That looks really good, but as I'll show you here in just a second, the protein quality in that forage or protein concentration is not as high as you might expect, just because it looks so lush and green. The digestibility, on the other hand, is very good. On the right, cattle are grazing Bermuda grass pasture. That picture was just taken last week, and that's regrowth from a hay meadow. The protein concentration in that species in a well-fertilized regrowth situation is generally going to be higher than the native grass, but the digestibility goes down lower. performance in cattle, if you think about the limiting factor that influences their average daily weight gain, generally speaking, it's either going to be protein or energy, and in some cases, it could be both. And so let's just take a look at how those change in these two major forage species here in Oklahoma, our general classes. So two data sets here I'm going to use. They're both older data sets, but the first one was collected here around Stillwater, and it's primarily a tall grass prairie data set based on big blue stem, switchgrass, and Indian grass, probably a considerable amount of little blue stem in this data set as well. This group collected data for 5 years, and both of these data sets represent forage nutritive value from fistulated, grazed fistulated forage samples. So that would differ from clip samples where you just clip the forage off at the ground and you harvest both the leaf and the stem material. Here, you know, these scientists were giving the cattle the opportunity to sort the forage based on their preference. And in almost every publication looking at that, the cattle generally select a substantially higher quality diet compared to the nutritive value that you'd get from the clip samples. Because, of course, the cattle try to avoid particularly the stem material. On the right, the Bermuda grass data set was collected down around El Reno. Both of these data sets continuously grazed, moderately stocked, 2 years worth of data here. And again, fistulated steer graze samples. The Bermuda grass, in this case, was fertilized in 3 applications, a total of 200 pounds for the year, May 1st, June 15th, and August 1. So here's the protein concentration in those two libraries. The darker green represents the fertilized Bermuda grass. The lighter green line or curve there represents the tall grass prairie forage. And as you can see, the Bermuda grass forage starts out, or at least the cattle select a substantially higher quality diet from a protein standpoint compared to the tall grass prairie. They both decline over time. The black line here represents the protein concentration or approximate requirement of cattle gaining 2 pounds a day. And so if you consider that by somewhere around, let's see, middle of July in the native pasture, you would expect, if that's a requirement for 2 pounds of weight gain, that beyond that point, protein availability in the diet would be the factor that's limiting the performance of these cattle. In the Bermuda grass pasture, because it starts out so much higher or more concentrated, the point at which the forage concentration crosses or drops below the requirement of the cattle is substantially later in the season. And in this case, it's around September. Now keep in mind that these cross points or times are going to be considerably variable. You know, obviously depending on the time of year. In the case of Bermuda grass, how much fertility, because the more nitrogen fertilizer you put out, generally the higher concentration of the protein. And then it'll also vary depending on grazing pressure. The more grazing pressure, the more you force the cattle to consume more of the stems and so on, the earlier the concentration is going to cross the animal's requirement or drop below the animal's requirement. So you would expect that, you know, supplementing cattle protein that are grazing tall grass prairies sometime beginning the month of July should result in a positive performance response. Protein is not going to be as valuable that early in Bermuda grass pastures, although it would be September and beyond. So in terms of digestibility, this graph is set up the same way. Now the two species are flipped, where tallgrass prairie is higher in digestibility, slightly with very high early in the season, and then drops off as time goes by. And notice that it drops off a little bit slower than the Bermuda grass forage does. And so with this curve, and the black line again represents the animal's requirement for energy for 2 pounds of weight gain. Here you see that the forage would actually drop below the animal's requirement for that 2 pounds of gain sometime during the month of August. On the other hand, the Bermuda grass is already starting to drop below that 2 pound weight gain requirement there towards the end of June. And particularly in the case of Bermuda grass, you could probably shift that to the left or right considerably depending on how the forage was managed. You'd expect it to drop lower more rapidly the higher the grazing concentration. You know, anytime you get flowering or seed heads forming, probably that digestibility is going down rapidly. So that just gives you an idea, but notice that in the, let's say the tallgrass prairie, the digestibility goes below the animal's requirement there in August, whereas in protein, that was the middle of July. So we've still got adequate energy in the tallgrass prairie during mid to late July and through the month of August, or maybe I said protein, I meant digestibility. We just don't have enough protein, so we can enhance our performance by providing that deficiency. The other thing that maybe we need to consider is vitamin A. Beta carotene is the precursor to vitamin A, and beef cattle have the capability in the rumen to transform beta carotene into active vitamin A. And here you see a forage concentration in an older data set of carotene, and notice that it's high in the springtime and early part of the summer, but through the late part of the summer, the concentration of beta carotene in forage drops off rapidly and nearly bottoms out here in November and December. And so any forage that is either grazed or harvested after the month of August is probably going to be marginal or deficient in beta carotene, and therefore vitamin A supplementation would be recommended. Okay, so this is a series of studies that were conducted by, actually it was Dr. Keith Lusby and Dr. Don Gill's group several years ago when they were developing the Oklahoma Gold program. And what they did was just a series of studies where they fed 1 pound of a high protein, all natural product. And by high protein, I mean somewhere in the neighborhood of 38 to 40%. It would be what the industry today considers 38% range cubes, is what they used in most of these situations. Here you see the initial date in the first column, the days that the study lasted, or the number of days that they measured weight gain, the cattle's initial weight. Then you've got the control group's average daily gain. This is the group that did not receive any summer supplementation. Then the supplemented or the treatment group average daily gain, which here is 1.88. And then we just calculated the difference between the control and the supplement in the next column. And then the final column on the right is a calculation for supplement conversion efficiency, which considers the added weight gain relative to the pounds of supplement fed. And of course, in this case, it's just around 1 pound of supplement fed. Okay, so let me just go ahead and pull in these other trials that have been done, and there have been 2 or 3 of these conducted here in more recent years. But there you see all of those studies, and what I want you to focus on is over here under the difference column. Notice that the response in all these different projects conducted around the state, primarily the state of Oklahoma, different weights of cattle, some steers, some heifers, and so on, but the response is relatively dependable, and you'd consider this to be relatively uniform. There's the average response of those experiments, and then you might say the same thing about the supplement conversion efficiency. So for every pound of additional weight gain, on average, with just a protein supplement, the cattle required 2.7 pounds of supplement to achieve 1 additional pound of weight gain. Okay, so then another component in the Oklahoma Gold program that's part of this late summer supplementation strategy would be to include an ionophore. The 3 products on the market today are Rumensin, Bovatec, and Catalyst. And the typical response, I didn't bother to pull up an entire literature review here for you, but generally speaking, most of the documented responses in summertime grazing cattle have been in the range of 0.1 to 0.2 pounds of additional weight gain per day. In fact, in one extensive literature review on Bovatec, the actual average over many different experiments was 0.17. So the Oklahoma Gold program is a combination of the 1 pound of the high protein supplement during that strategic time of the year, in other words, late summer, vitamin A to ensure that the cattle don't get short in that vitamin, trace minerals, and then the ionophore. It can be fed every other day or prorated for Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, feeding with anticipated performance between daily and 2 or 3 times a week being equal. Response in these studies was 0.37 if you average them all. The response to the ionophore in these projects where they did have protein with and without an ionophore was somewhere in that 0.2 pound range, maybe just slightly below. And then overall, the response to the combined Oklahoma Gold product was 0.57 pounds of additional weight gain per day. Supplement efficiency on average with the combination of protein and the ionophore was 1.8. So I called and got an estimate of the cost of Oklahoma Gold product today. And the answer was that it's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of around 19 cents a pound or $380 a ton. Now that's with the added trace minerals, with the added vitamin A, with the ionophore. All right, so if you multiply, I'm just going to grab my phone here. If you multiply 19 cents times, it takes 1.8 pounds of that to get an additional pound of weight gain, the cost per pound of added weight gain is 34 cents in this case. And so you'd have to calculate the value, your anticipated value for additional cattle weight gain. But, you know, in today's market, it's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of probably $1 to $1.20 per pound of weight gain. So at a feed cost, now we haven't included labor to deliver this product, but at a feed cost of 34 cents per pound of added gain, the late summer supplementation with a little bit of protein and an ionophore is very cost effective most of the time. Super Gold is a little different product that was developed by Dr. Gillen Lusby. It's same concept, but this product addresses the midsummer decline in forage digestibility or energy. It's designed to be delivered at 2.5 pounds a day. So instead of delivering 1 pound, you're delivering more energy. and therefore it can replace some forage in cases where forage might begin to get a little bit short, and certainly it's going to stimulate weight gain where that forage digestibility is going down. Similar to the Oklahoma Gold, it's got going to have vitamins, minerals, and the feed additive or an ionophore. It also can be fed every day or every other day. Probably would have to be cautious about feeding this product twice a week because the total amount delivered on a 2.5 pound per day basis would get to be quite a bit. Response in studies that were conducted with the Super Gold program, the total response to the combined product was 0.76 pounds per head per day. And again, you know, they're filling the protein gap and also filling that energy gap later in the summer. And so because you're feeding more energy along with protein, you would expect a little bit higher rate of weight gain. The supplement efficiency is not quite as good here because we are feeding more. And in this case, the average supplement efficiency in the Super Gold was about 3.3 pounds of supplement per pound of added weight gain. Okay, so that's kind of my introduction to this program that's been very popular here in Oklahoma. It still works today. If you are grazing stocker cattle, or if you have replacement heifers, perhaps fall-born replacement heifers that are going to be going into the breeding season here in the next few weeks, it's something you really might want to consider. Dr. Beck, if I will unshare mine, we're going to ask Dr. Beck to talk about some of the similar type of research he's conducting now.
Okay, so when we started looking at different supplementation programs in Oklahoma, when we look at the Super Gold, that was very popular for, you know, at least the last for right in there about 15, 20 years, and then we started getting a lot of byproducts that became available. So it seemed to me, just dealing with producers, that we had a lot more people that had gone to the more of a byproduct type feed, which fits more with the Super Gold type program, that lower or moderate protein type supplement. So, you know, I started looking at distillers grains as a summer supplement. I know there's been a lot of work done with them, but for pasture supplements, it hasn't really been utilized as much as with finishing systems and backgrounding yards, unless we have feed bunks available, which that starts concentrating cattle in certain areas of pasture, disrupts grazing behavior. So a lot of people just don't do it. So I was looking at, this is actually Brian Nichols' undergraduate research project when he was at Noble Foundation or Noble Research Institute as it is now. And they wanted to look at losses of byproducts if they're feeding them on the ground. And in order to measure that, they just put some turf grass, some astroturf in the bottom of a feed bunk, screwed it down, and then fed cattle on top of that to try to estimate. And, you know, they found an average feed waste of about 12.6%, which is just a net loss. And I believe if we're going to feed this on the ground and it's dusty and dirty, there'll be a bigger loss than that, you know, approaching, you know, that 15 to 20% loss, which, you know, we can spend a lot less money on some byproducts than we would a cube, but if we're feeding them on the ground, they'd better be a lot cheaper. So currently there's become available some dried distillers cubes, which are a 100% dried distillers grains. They've got a new extrusion type process they're using to create these cubes. There are not a lot of fines in them, fairly stable cube. And with the heat and pressure from that, and I've got up here the straight distillers before their extrusion process, and then the distillers cubes after the extrusion process, compared to a commercial 38 cube. Protein's going to be about 10% lower than that cube little bit higher fat, and even though there's higher NDF, we're going to increase the TDN of those cubes, primarily with the digestibility of the NDF and the fat level. But when we're comparing pre-process versus post-process, we're actually increasing crude protein a little bit in the cubes, decreasing NDF in the cubes, and increasing fat, just because we're disrupting some of those cell walls and some of that fiber in that. So the calculated TDN and the energy values of the cubes is actually slightly higher in that, which is something I find interesting. It may not be incredibly important, that 2% in TDN, but it is interesting that happens. So we've got actually 3 research projects going on. We have data on 2 of those. 2 of those projects are on Western Native Range, one at the USDA ARS Southern Plains Experimental Range north of Fort Supply, and the other at the Marvin Clemmy Range Research Station southwest of Clinton by the town of Bessie. So at the USDA station, we have an actual negative control and a positive control, which is based on the Oklahoma Super Gold program. We have those both stocked at a moderate rate that was identified by grazing studies and that conducted in the past to catch their moderate stocking rate. Hopefully this would get us through most years. With the control, they only received a complete mineral supplement. In the positive control, we are feeding 2 pounds per day of during the late season only, from July through the end of September, but we're prorating that for 3 days a week. So right at 4.6 pounds per head every time we feed. Then, because when we start looking at the USDA reports as far as land costs and rental rates, they've gone up quite a bit. The latest report shows for this area in western Oklahoma, it's about $11 per acre, which would be about $53, $55 per steer at our moderate stocking rate. So we wanted to use the distillers grains at a higher feeding rate to intensify production and hopefully offset some of the cost of high rents. So it's at 0.75% of body weight all season long, fed 5 days per week, and the average feeding rate for that was 6.8 pounds per head. So here's an example of the range resource. It's a sand sagebrush resource up at the USDA station. Lots of midgrass prairie in the bottoms. There's a lot of buffalo grass up on top, but in the bottoms there are some tall grass species. Fairly rugged country. Here's the forage quality of what we tried to estimate would be the diet quality. Notice the crude protein on these pastures don't get as low as early as what Dave indicated earlier, and our dry matter disappearance doesn't get as low in the late summer. But they're both become limiting for those cattle, to gain 2 pounds a day, and right here in May, when it's in the best of situations, it's right at that requirement for 2 pounds of gain a day. At the Marvin Clemmy Research Range in Bessie, it's a rolling red shale hills type of range, mostly midgrass prairie, some tall grass, and a lot of short grass species as well. Similar trial, only we didn't have the negative control because of pasture resources that were available. And we don't have the forage analysis done for this last year yet. So at the Southern Plains Range Research Station, during the early summer, those cattle that were not supplemented only gained about 1.5 pounds a day. Even though we increased stocking rates because we fed those cattle quite a bit of supplement, right at, 5 to 5.25 pounds per head per day, prorated on that 5 days per week, we increased gains on those cattle by about 0.6 of a pound per day. During the late summer, gains on our controls went down to 1.25 pounds per day. When we fed that Oklahoma Super Gold type equivalent product, we got nearly 2 pounds a day with that. And then during the late summer, those bigger cattle, even at the higher stocking rates, we increased gains up to about 2.3 pounds per day. So the total gain over the whole season was increased from about 1.3 up to about 1.7 whenever we utilized Super Gold, which is a fairly good gain response at 2.7 pounds per day. So we actually beat the average of the trials from all the work that Dr. Lusby did. And with our high supplement, our total season average daily gain was right at 2.1 pounds a day. And our gain per acre increased from 30 up to 40 with the Super Gold. And then we nearly doubled it whenever we increased our stocking rate and increased total gain. So our supplemental efficiency based on increased gain per acre for that was right at 4 pounds per day. When we figured our net returns, including feed delivery costs, all the health costs that are associated with the animals and rent, we nearly tripled our total net return per acre. When we look at the Marvin Clemmy range, similar increases in gains during the early season, right at 0.9 pounds per day during the early summer when we were supplementing. Slightly lower gains with our high supplement versus our late summer supplementation, but we still doubled total body weight gain per acre. And whenever we look at that on a per acre basis, our supplemental efficiency compared to that Oklahoma Super Gold program was right at 3 pounds of feed per pound of added gain. And also, again, we were able to double the return per acre in that. So this, looks like we've got an effective supplement to increase body weight gain during the late summer, comparable or better to the Oklahoma Super Gold response. We can increase stocking rates during the total summer in Oklahoma without a negative impact on body weight gain, and that leads us to an increase in total gain per acre. Our net return is substantially increased with this increase in carrying capacity, but we don't know yet what the long-term implications will be on range condition, and so we're going to need to evaluate this further. But in real good positive economic climates, when we have a good prospect for summer grazing, this may be something that will work, at least some years when the economics are right. So I appreciate the opportunity to present this research, and I'm going to stop sharing and let anybody ask questions if we have them, and I appreciate you all attending the session today.
Any questions for Dr. Becker, myself? Not seeing any. Feel free to type a question in the chat or unmute yourself and just ask. Tell you what, on our way out, I've got just a simple little poll question. It'd be interesting to know at what time most of you pull your cattle off of grass. And so I'm just going to launch this little poll. We appreciate you joining us today. Hope to see you next Thursday at 12:30. Let's see. Next week, we're going to be talking about stockpiling Bermuda grass for fall grazing. So thank you all so much. Hope to see you soon.